It's my absolute pleasure to be here. I would much rather be with you in person, but of course we're on a Zoom world at the moment, so I'm joining you from Toronto in Canada. And thank you all for taking a couple of hours out of your extremely busy work week and your day to listen and to participate in today's session. Now, first of all, I am hopefully about to share my screen with you, so let's get started on the presentation. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen now. So I am just going to keep going. So today I am going to be talking to you about this concept of developing the professionally led education system in Wales. And this is a concept that has become talked about quite widely. So organizations like the OECD talk about a professionally led education system. The idea that you, the professionals that work in education, are the key to future improvement. So I'm going to talk about this concept drawing on some of my own research. There's going to be chances for you to discuss in breakout rooms and also chances to interact on chat and feedback and a question and answer period as well. So the very first thing I want to say, and the most important thing, is thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for all that you have been doing over this past 13 months as we've dealt with a pandemic. And it's very clear that you and your work matters, whatever your role is in education and at whatever level of education, because I know it's mostly people from schools and linked to schools today, but also for people that are involved in further education, post-secondary education. So there's no doubt that your work is crucial, and I'm going to talk more about that today. Now, my entire career has been in education, and my mother was a teacher, so of course I believe education is important. But this isn't just what I believe, and hopefully what you believe as well. We have substantial evidence now about the importance of the education profession. So on the screen, I'm sharing some of the research that I personally have been involved in, and I will draw on some of this work today. However, of course, it's not just my work. There's a much wider body of research and practice, including in Wales. And thank you for your work, and Alma Harris and Michelle Jones and other colleagues in Wales that I've had the pleasure of collaborating with. So what we know is about the importance of the education profession, and I'm going to talk more about that. I have three themes that I would like to discuss as we go through today. The first is the impact of COVID. We can't avoid the fact that COVID has had an impact. So as we come towards the end of the current school year, to think about the impact of COVID and plans for the upcoming school year. Coming back to this theme of developing a professionally led education system, and then the leadership and professional learning piece. So we'll go through these in chunks and you'll have a chance to discuss each one. So let's start with the impact of COVID. So this is the words of Charles Maxey, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Can a storm change you? Yes, said the horse, often into the shape of one who holds others in a storm. And as educators, you have been asked to hold others through this storm of this pandemic. The children and young people in your care, for those of you in leadership positions, the staff in your care, and for those of you, of course, working with communities, parents and family members. So thinking about what you have learned about your own leadership, as well as about the people that you serve and you support as we move through this pandemic. So I'm going to draw on two studies to share some of the themes that we're finding here in Canada. And now I apologise, it's Canadian evidence, so I am going to ask you to think about what does or does not resonate with your experience and your context in Wales. So to give you a sort of general picture, across Canada last spring, when the global pandemic was first announced, the majority of schools closed for in-person learning and switched to remote learning, which took a wide range of forms. Obviously online learning, but we don't have universal access to internet and devices, so a range of remote learning. Here in Ontario, as the spring, summer moved on, there was a return to in-person schooling. However, one thing that our government did that I think is different from Wales is our government gave parents the universal right to choose online learning instead of in-person learning. So we now have a substantial portion of our students fully online by the choice of the parents or the guardian. We also have students in-person learning, and we have some students in secondary schools who are in hybrid forms of learning, part of their time in school, part of their time online. Currently, as of today, our schools are closed for in-person learning, except for children with special educational needs for whom online learning is not suitable. So most of our students are currently at home in remote learning because we are in the middle of a very difficult third wave. So there are differences in context, but let me highlight some of what we found across Canada. One is based on a survey of children themselves, age 9 to 15. That's the maximum city study that you can see on your screen. And the other is a survey of educators by the Canadian Teachers Federation. And in both cases, there were surveys conducted in spring last year, in autumn, and a follow-up in winter. So I'll pull up some key findings. So the first thing to note is the concerns about equity, and we're seeing this across the world. In that period in spring last year, when we moved to fully remote learning, educators expressed particular concerns about students living in poverty, students with exceptionalities, students in single-parent households, and English language learners in managing the transition to online learning for a range of reasons. Some is about the digital divide, access to devices and internet. Some is about the capacity of there to be a parent at home, and when you think about working parents. So how do we ensure at this time that inequities are being addressed and concerns that indeed inequities may be increasing for our students? In terms of student learning, when students were surveyed in autumn, so in spring, we had the disruption, as was experienced also in Wales, of a switch to remote learning. I know that's been different in your context. However, in autumn, we continue to see concerns as students navigate that mixture I mentioned of in-person, online, or hybrid learning. And students have reported that their learning has further decreased in the autumn. And most notably, almost half of the students in hybrid learning say their learning has decreased. So how do we ensure a blend of in-person and online that's actually engaging for students? We've also seen students reporting increases in difficulty collaborating and in concentrating as they're working through these different ways of learning and of teaching. However, as we move through the pandemic, we're also seeing students report gains in their learning in terms of increases in empathy and in citizenship. So this idea that, our students now thinking about themselves, their families, their communities, but also this global experience that we're going through, and how do we further develop those skills? Here, the green bar is from the spring of last year and the orange is from autumn. We're seeing concerns about students' physical health, decreases in physical activity, increases in screen time, and some disruption to sleep. But there's also serious concerns about mental health. We have reports, we have some students who are flourishing. They're navigating through this successfully and they're learning in different ways. But we have majority of our students are expressing mental health concerns. And I mentioned that we're currently in a third wave. What we're seeing is that students are actually expressing more anxiety the longer this pandemic continues. And that students who are in Black, Indigenous or people of colour, or racialised students and Indigenous students are particularly negatively affected, worried about getting COVID, worried about falling behind at school, afraid to go outside. Almost half of our BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of colour, and this is concern about COVID, but it's also concern we now have issues around anti-Asian racism linked to the pandemic, as well as other forms of racism. And students also feel that their own ideas and worries are being overlooked. So the whole piece about student voice and how we help students navigate through this. And then you, for those of you who work in our education systems, another Charlie Maxey quote, "One day you will see just how brave you have been. On a scale of 0 to 100, how stressful is your job right now?" So 0 is not stressful at all, 100 is off the charts stressful. Well, this is what our Canadian educators said. And look at that line on the 100. That's not sustainable. That's not healthy. That's not where you want to be as a professional. So we have to really think about the well-being of the profession as well as of our students. Another Charlie Maxey quote, "Have you met others who have struggled? I've never met anyone who hasn't," said the horse. I've struggled. My friends who are teachers and school head teachers here are struggling. How well are you coping with the daily stresses of teaching right now? Somewhat coping, barely coping, coping well, coping extremely well. And people have been phenomenal in rising to this challenge, in leading the way forward, as I mentioned before, of finding ways through this, and I will talk about that. But we also need to say, how do we support the profession? So as we look to the upcoming school year, of course, all these factors about our students, but also about staff, about the adults. And how are people finding ways to cope? Well, reaching out to colleagues, to family, to friends, to your students' families, to administrators, and to your professional associations. Collaboration has become even more important. So that was a quick run through of some of what we're seeing here in Canada. And I'm going to ask you now to think about, in your experience and context, what have been the main impacts of the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic for the education profession? So thinking about the profession as well as the students, but today's mostly about the profession. What's been the impact for you and your colleagues? So I'm going to pause briefly before we go to section 2. If you have any comments or feedback or questions, please use the chat function. I'll do my best to monitor it as we go through. But perhaps if we could just take feedback from one group. Now, I might need help with this because I can't see everybody on my screen the way things are set up. So is anybody willing to share some feedback from one group? I might need you to shout
Margaret
out.
Phelan, Group 5, I'm happy to share.
Thanks very much, Margaret.
Okay, I think there are three key things that we'd like to share. One is that in terms of the research that we've seen that's been conducted in Wales, in terms of mental health and well-being across the student and the staff cohort, there are similar sorts of results. I think the second thing that we want to share is the significant impact that this has had on staff who work through agency work. So their income has been devastated, and there doesn't appear to have been the flexibility in terms of decision making and leadership to accommodate that group of staff that the sector relies on, but they seem to have been forgotten. So that was another important point. And I finish on a positive. I think from my own experience, from the experience of others in the group, there's been a significant change in the discourse and the trust relationships that we've been engaged in over the last 13 months. I think there have been some really effective conversations that have resulted in some really good solutions to deal with things that we couldn't do in the same way that we've done for years. So we've had to move quickly and we've had to find new ways of doing things. And I think one of the things that we would like to come out of that is to find a way of making sure that we can embed that going forward and that we don't lose all of that good practice that we had to engage in order to keep people learning and keep people teaching. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. That's extremely helpful feedback. And we will have it several times for feedback as well as for questions and answers and for the chat. But I'm actually going to keep going because I want to be respectful of making sure that we finish on time. So Margaret, that was actually a perfect segue into where I'm going next, to think about how we support everyone who's involved in working in education. So your point about agency staff and also the trust piece. The trust piece is absolutely huge. So if I go to my next slide. I'm going to come to this idea of developing a professionally led education system. And for this one, I'm going to draw on a study called Constructing Teachers' Professional Identities. And this was commissioned by Education International, who are the umbrella teacher union for the world. And the work was also conducted and led by Philip Accordingly, who will be familiar to you. And in this, we looked at the nature of teachers' work. But, to Margaret's point, I want to talk more broadly than teachers, the people who work in education in a range of roles. And this idea around a professionally led education system. So the first slide I want to share with you is that this study was conducted prior to COVID in 2018. So I want you to think about the points that have already been raised in terms of how has this, what I'm about to talk about, changed or not with the experience of the pandemic over the past year or so. So when we conducted this study with 4,500 educators, teachers and head teachers and policymakers in 7 different jurisdictions, we looked at 7 jurisdictions who were in very different places in terms of their education system's performance, whatever you think of PISA, but the education system's performance, and in their support or not for the education profession. So Singapore, Ontario, where I'm based, Berlin, Sweden, Scotland, where I'm an advisor, Chile and Kenya. Now, what we clearly saw then, albeit this was 2018 and things have changed in some of these contexts, including Scotland and Ontario, was that those education systems where the people working in education generally felt that they had higher status and respect and trust are also those education systems that tend to perform at higher levels in terms of student achievement and equity of outcomes. So when we think about investing in education, in order to support students, we need to invest in the profession. It's not an either or. The education systems that invest in the profession are also those that tend to be performing better. So we made some recommendations based on this work, And these were the recommendations we made. And I'm going to ask you again to think about, in your context in Wales, to what extent these exist and how have they changed or not over the past 12 months. So the first recommendation is about the overall system, the education system, to think about positive links to career paths and teacher supply. And I know that that is something that EWC and Wales have been looking at, making education an attractive career, recruitment, development, retention, and career opportunities. To think about, and this was focused on teachers, but I will talk about it more broadly about education workers, educators, and people linked to education in various ways. When we think about how we're trying to improve education systems, and Wales has done a huge amount of work involved in a lot of change and very important work, how does that affect teachers and other people's professional identities? So thinking about when we bring about changes, whether in curriculum or assessments or in other factors, how it links to the working lives of the people involved. And there needs to be very explicit policies for raising the status of the profession. It doesn't just happen. It's important. How do we value people who work in education? And how does that reflected in how your government talks, what's in the media, how you are involved, how EWC and the universities are involved, explicit policies. And the work of educators, respect for education and respect for teachers and teaching. One thing that's become clear over the past 12 months is that schools absolutely are central to our communities and to our societies, and thinking about that respect for well-being. Expectations about time and work-life balance. This is a very long-standing issue. Workload, work intensification, and certainly in our context, it has become worse over the past 12 months, having to deal with all the changes, but thinking about that piece. And then when we think about the changes for students, as I was talking about earlier, equity, health and well-being, learning, but also thinking about what are the implications for the professionals, the adults that work in education too. You need to think about both, how we're supporting our students, but how we're supporting the profession. Teacher autonomy, so teacher-led, I'll broaden out, educator-led, a professionally led education system where the people who work in education have their voices valued, are part of the decision-making, have some levels of autonomy, not complete autonomy because you work within a system, but thinking about how it's the profession that are informing the best advice. Trust, as Group 5 have discussed and mentioned, trust is so important. It takes so long to develop and it's so fragile. So if trust has developed more, how do you ensure that becomes part of the way going forward? And then teacher leadership, but other forms of leadership of the people who work in education, who know best your students and your communities and your contexts. And professional learning and development, which is my main focus for the third section of today's masterclass. But the importance of professional learning and development, that we prioritise that when we're in times of austerity and now also a pandemic. Sometimes professional learning is challenged, but I know in Wales, professional learning is seen as central. So how do you link that professional learning with student success and sustain it over time? I'm going to go deeper on that in a few minutes. So that was a quick run through of some of the key elements of this idea of a professionally led education system. So as you look to the upcoming school year, what are some of the priorities for developing a professionally led education system in Wales and in your context? The system pieces, the educators' roles and values, professional autonomy and leadership and trust, and professional learning we'll focus on a bit more in section 3. So again, I'll ask for some feedback if that's possible. So we heard briefly from Margaret in group 5 for the first session. Could a couple of other breakout groups volunteer to provide some feedback, either on the discussion that you've just had or the discussion over the afternoon so far? And I'll need you to shout out because I can't see everybody on my screen. Can I get a volunteer from one of the breakouts to provide some comments about what you discussed?
I can talk from our breakout, but I don't know which group I was in, sorry.
That's okay, thanks Tracy.
It's been really interesting in the breakout group to have representation from FE, work-based learning, ESTIN, and primary and secondary schools for a start. So I'd like to thank the EWC for organising that. I think at the moment we're in an unknown position where we're not quite sure what's going to happen over the summer. You know, on one hand we're looking for a third wave. On the other hand, you can book your holidays from next week. So it's all unknowns, which makes it difficult for leaders to then plan for priorities for September. One of our members talked about, so we don't know the arena we're going back to, but we can plan for the best case scenario. Then we've got the momentum. Staff have been so upskilled in the last 12 months. In our school, personally, my staff have had time to go and read Curriculum for Wales in a meaningful way and discuss it online rather than trying to fit it in between being teachers. 3 to 16 have also got the added interesting factor of the ALN reforms, Curriculum for Wales, wellbeing, Welsh and education, and to make sure that the resilience that the teachers have had to show in the last 12 months isn't going to break them now by saying, okay, you've had 12 months of this, now we've got to look at Curriculum for Wales, now we've got to look at ALN. Our school, personally, we feel like we've forgotten everything. We were well on the road up to 2022, but 12 months out, it's sort of like the teachers have to build up their stamina again for a full-time class. And just from Eston, and I would agree with Claire because I'm on the head teacher group, it's been really valuable having the head teacher group with Eston because we've really collaborated well, and it's basically been, what do schools want from Eston? We want you to just come and do a health check. Are we doing what we should be doing? What could we be doing better? Do we know? And for Eston to say to us, well, we need to work together and make sure that, you're on that right path. So, and not to be scared of Eston, because schools traditionally have, not through Eston, it's not Eston's fault, have been told by LA and where, oh, Eston are coming, everyone's up in arms and changing displays, but for that culture to change. So lots of positives as well as just the unknown at the moment.
Thanks, Tracy. I'm not sure if like's the right word, but unknown certainly captures a lot of what we've had to learn to deal with over the past year. And I appreciate you talking about the upskilling, but also it's been an unusual year. So what happens next year? Can I get feedback from one more group, a different group? And again, I'll just ask somebody to shout out so you come up on the speaker view. Thanks to Tracy and to her group.
Sorry, Nicola, and from group 6.
Thanks, Nicola.
We had a slightly different conversation regarding Eston, and some of the members felt that quite pressurised in terms of Eston and the involvement at the moment, and felt that they could do with a 12-month breather in order to focus on what needs to be done in the new curriculum, etc. And what we also did discuss is that recognition about the ability to enter into rapid change and recognising how brilliant people have been and what can we harness from that going into the future. So reflecting on what we want to keep and develop, because obviously there's been significant new working practices. And as you said in your presentation, some of those have had really positive results. And what can we keep from that in a new world? Because we don't know how long COVID is going to be with us. It could be, you know, it's an indefinite thing at the minute, isn't it? But yeah, that's pretty much what we talked about. But about, you know, recognising also the pressures which have been put on school leaders, you know, where there's so many conflicting priorities, and with keeping health, well-being and children at the forefront of what we're doing.
Yeah, thanks. It's the tension between, you know, the ongoing business of education and dealing with a pandemic, and the piece about, you know, even though people want to get back to normal, the future shouldn't be the same as the past, because we have learned so much about our students, our young people, ourselves, and each other. So I think that's really important, and I appreciate you joining today and taking the time to sort of reflect on what you and we have learned. I know we're only in April, but thinking about the upcoming school year, and as Tracy has said, there's lots of unknowns. There are some knowns too. So thank you for that. We're about to go into a discussion around the leadership and professional learning piece, which has already been running through our themes. We're on to the third, which is the final main section of the masterclass for today, where we're going to look into leadership and professional learning during and beyond the pandemic. And I know certainly through like Alma Harris and Michelle Jones and other people's work that there's a tremendous amount of work in terms of leadership and professional learning in Wales. So again, I'm going to draw on some of my own research, which is in the Canadian context, but ask you to think about the connections or not to the work that you're doing in your own context. And I'm delighted to be collaborating with Alma, Professor Harris, on a leadership review for Wales. So I'm pleased to be involved in that work. Now, the work that I'm about to talk about draws on 3 studies in particular. The first is called The State of Educators' Professional Learning in Canada, and that was commissioned by Learning Forward. So it's freely available on the Learning Forward website. And in fact, there's a whole series of reports. So Andy Hargreaves and Michael Fullen wrote a rejoinder to my report on professional learning in Canada, and there's case studies all freely available. So you're welcome to take a look at that. The teacher learning and leadership program work that I've been involved in. This one is a book, so it's for sale, but you can also look at the Ontario Teachers Federation, OTF website, where we have all of our research and other resources linked to this program. And finally, that constructing teachers' professional identities that I discussed in section 2, and it's available again for free on Education International's website. So I'll certainly make sure that all of these links and resources are available through EWC to share with you should you want to look into some of this work more. So I'm going to start around effective professional learning. Now, there is a large body of research on professional learning. I've already mentioned that there's wonderful work happening in Wales and being developed in Wales. There are many syntheses of professional learning. I'm going to talk about this particular study, which builds on some of that work, and talk about what we learned when we were trying to see what does effective professional learning look like. So there's sort of 3 big ideas in terms of how we define effective professional learning. And again, think about this in your context. The first big idea is quality content matters. Now, that might seem super obvious, but sometimes when we get caught up in thinking about professional learning communities and inquiry, we think about the processes, which are also important, but the content really matters. So as you've been already sharing with me through your discussions, thinking about what are those professional learning priorities for the upcoming school year? How do you build on the growth in learning that has been experienced, excuse me, as well as the ongoing need for curriculum implementation and the range of initiatives that you're responsible for? Excuse me. So what we saw for identifying effective professional learning priorities was that piece around drawing on the evidence that you have from your students, from your staff if you're in that position, from yourself, inquiry and professional judgment, to think about what is it that we most need at this moment in time. And I've seen Lee's comments in the chat box about, thinking not only about full-time teachers, excuse me, but also about supply teachers and agency staff. So what are the needs for professional learning? What are teachers, but also others' priority needs linked to students' learning? So when we've talked about student equity, well-being and learning and health, what are the professional learning needs linked to those student needs? And focusing on a broad range of students and professional learning outcomes. So, I've touched upon learning and I've mentioned things like PISA and achievement. Of course, student achievement or attainment continues to matter. But what we're seeing, especially in the pandemic, is well-being, health, but also a broader range of skills around self-regulation, independent learners. All of these skills matter. And also thinking about professionals' learning needs as important in their own right, not just as about linking to student needs, but when we talk about some of the themes that you've already mentioned, resilience, about the fact that supply teachers need more support, quite rightly, how do we make sure that professional learning needs are met? Because the professions, efficacy, competency, skills, knowledge, practice, of course, are crucial. And that fourth point about the balance between system-directed and self-directed professional learning. So you've already mentioned a number of system level factors in Wales when you've been feeding back around the curriculum, health and well-being, the role of Eston, other factors. And this in our Canada study was actually the most difficult, in that there will be and there are system priorities that you're responsible for knowing and for implementing. At the same time, professionals need some space for their own learning needs. What is it that's particularly important to you at this moment in time, linked to your work and your context? So it's not an either or, you need both. System level, whenever there's a new initiative, professional learning to support that, but also individual and collaborative professional learning. Which takes me to the second big idea, which is about the learning design and implementation. Think about, in terms of your professional learning passports, this masterclass, other factors, the opportunities to engage in multiple professional learning, differentiated to professional needs. There is no one size fits all, nor should there be. For some people, this masterclass might be effective, for others it's not. Thinking about the range of professional learnings that you and your colleagues can engage in. Collaborative learning can be powerful and is very important. And that we have seen actually over the pandemic increase in importance as we're navigating our way through these changing times, reaching out to peers, to colleagues for support, for advice, sharing resources, co-developing resources, thinking about collaboration within your organisation, a school or a college or wherever you work, but also networking as you're doing today with others to see and hear and develop practices beyond your immediate context. And the key thing is relevant and practical professional learning linked to your needs, like really practical, sharing resources, tips, techniques, observing teaching or other practices. So when we talk about job embedded, there's a lot of focus on job embedded professional learning within your classroom, within your school. But sometimes you also need to reach out to external expertise for other perspectives. So the key thing is the relevant and practical sharing. And support and sustainability. Time. Time is the tricky part. It's the most important part, but you need time for professional learning integrated within educators' work lives. It can't be another add-on on top of already intensified workload. So thinking about time. Now, it takes on average 50 hours, at least 50 hours of professional learning to really change professional knowledge, skills and practices that have a result for students' outcomes. Now, think about that not as 50 times a 1 hour workshop, or in this case, it's a 2 hour masterclass, not 25 masterclasses, but how you would sequence time on a topic, whether it's 50 hours on one topic or a sequence of linked topics, and how you can build that into the work day, whether that's in terms of meetings or professional learning opportunities or other experiences. As you think to the next school year, what would be the sequence of activities? We found in Canada that even though 50 hours sounds like a lot, and most of our educators reported spending over 70 hours on professional learning. Now that could be reading a book in the evening or the weekend or before school, but the key thing was that sustained and cumulative, that it has to be linked in a way. Equitable access to resources. This was a big issue here. And I see in the chat function, it's also a concern in Wales. We found that some of our teachers had less access to professional learning. Certainly teachers who were supply teachers don't always have access to the same professional learning opportunities. Rural teachers didn't always have the same access. And then in our context, French language teachers and teachers in Indigenous communities. But how do we make sure everyone has access to high quality professional learning at all stages of their career? And then for those of you who are in leadership positions, your work really matters. And I wrote an article for the Wales Journal of Education on the topic of leadership of professional learning. So that's available if you want to look at that. But what we see is the role of leaders in enabling professional learning, in modeling professional learning, in engaging in professional learning, and valuing professional learning in terms of resources like time and access and opportunities. And for leaders, all of the things I've said matter too. You need time, you need to have opportunities for collaboration, and you need to be supported in your professional learning. So I'm going to give you one example that I think brings together a lot of what I've sort of outlined as the features of effective professional learning: quality content, learning design and implementation, support and sustainability. This is the Ontario's Teacher Learning and Leadership Programme, and I know you also have a range of professional learning opportunities. In the Teacher Learning and Leadership Programme, the idea was to support experienced teachers. So we have an induction period for the first 2 years of permanent teaching. So to export teachers beyond induction, and also teachers at this time who were not seeking to move into formal leadership positions like head teacher, although some ended up doing that. But this was for experienced classroom teachers who had something they really wanted to develop their knowledge in, usually something linked to their students, an area of need of curriculum, of teaching, of community context. And these teachers had the opportunity, either individually or more often in a team, to take forward a project over 18 months. So they would be planning it about this time of year, start it for the next school year, run their project for a year, and then report and share their findings afterwards. And key things were that the teachers became responsible for their own professional learning, but also for peers' professional learning. So teachers, not just of student learning, but now of professional learning, and that they committed to sharing their knowledge with other colleagues. So I'll give you one example, and I'm not saying you need to do this particular example, but as you're thinking ahead, what might be some key professional learning priorities to take forward? So this one's called Up Mathematics, Ultimate Potential Mathematics. And this was a school in Ontario where initially 17% of their students were achieving the provincial standard. So we have provincial standardized assessments. 17% of students were achieving the provincial standard in grade 9 applied mathematics. And they began this process of teacher-led professional learning to change that trajectory. And by 2016, 73% of students, so they went from 17 to 71 and have increased since then. So what did they do? Well, firstly, they used a diagnostic, a continuum-based math diagnostic, so a way of looking at a student's learning to see where their areas of challenge were in their mathematics. They began to differentiate their instruction to support the students' needs, and they engaged in a collaborative inquiry professional learning community where they co-planned, they observed each other's teaching, and they looked at lessons. And you might think that's what made the difference. But actually, even after doing that, they hadn't got the results that they had hoped they would get. So they began to say, well, what's going on here? You know, we're doing all the right things. We're using diagnostic or formative assessment. We're changing our instruction. We're learning together. So in the next project, they looked to the research to see what else could they be doing. And they began to look at issues around mathematics anxiety. And they looked at information concerning whether the students thought they liked math or they were good at math. And what they discovered was there were these deep feelings of, I'm not good at math, I don't like math. So they began work on that, and they brought in integration of technology. So they actually created an app which is available, and they used iPads for journaling and using students to reflect on and think about their learning. And through this, they actually developed a program which brought together opportunities for students to center themselves, to think about their attitudes to math, their gratitude, as well as the teaching and learning piece. And that is how they brought about the change. So with that in mind, they then began with the Up Mathematics, which started in one school, spread to more schools, spread to entire school board, and is now used across Ontario, and indeed is picked up by some other education systems internationally. And that took them into this work called NORCAN, the Norway-Canada Partnership. And in NORCAN, schools from Alberta, Ontario, and Norway came together with this guiding question. How can an international network of schools and educators committed to mindful leadership help to identify obstacles to students' mathematics learning and develop strategies for attaining success? Now, what was different about NORCAN was that in this initiative, the teams were a wider group of people. So school leaders were involved, other relevant staff from within the school building were part of the team, and students themselves were part of the team. And they shared resources online. At that time they could visit, so they visited schools in person, but they found that the in-between learning, the emails, the follow-up, the sharing of resources was where they really learned and tried out different things. So You don't have to go to Norway or Canada, but thinking about how you can share resources and ideas and collaborate across organisations within Wales. And Leanne Oliver, who was one of the leads on this work, said that the idea of going to other schools, learning from other schools, whether locally or internationally, was that it wasn't just about learning from them, it was about seeing her own context and our own practice differently. We went to the moon, and as a result, we saw the earth differently. It's not necessarily that there are better practices out there, but it's a chance to reflect as you share and discuss in collaboration and in networks. So, bringing all of this together, this idea of a professionally led education system. Formal leadership, for those of you who are in formal leadership positions, matters, but also the informal leadership of all of the people who are involved. One thing we've learned from COVID is while most of my work has been around teacher leadership, it's every education worker that matters and everyone that's connected to education. So how do we draw on each person's professional judgment, expertise and experience? How are you engaging in and leading professional learning and collaboration? What do you need to learn now, and how will you learn it over the coming year? Deprivatisation of practices, sharing your knowledge, practices and learning. What do you know? And don't be modest. What is it that you just know? You have a tacit knowledge about something, but other people would really love to learn about that. So how can you share? The idea of literally sharing your knowledge, whether it's in person, online, blogs, social media, workshops, all sorts of ways. How will you share your practice? So that idea about knowledge mobilization, how will you share learning? Whether it's through written work, spoken work, other ways of sharing. We saw a rapid increase in the use of online forms of sharing, social media, blogs, podcasts, websites, all sorts of things. But of course, conversations and professional learning in person also matter when that's possible. So excuse me for my throat. My final sort of question to you now is, looking to next school year, what are your professional learning priorities? And that might be for yourself or your team, depending what role you're in. What are your professional learning priorities? And what is one leadership action, whatever role you're in, you will take to support developing the education profession? Okay, we have 3 breakout groups who haven't had a chance to respond yet, and then we're going to have a brief time for some questions and answers with myself and with Angela Jardine. Has any group that's not had a chance to provide feedback, would you like to shout out now and say any reflections or comments from your breakout discussions, please?
I'll go for group 4.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. So we had some really interesting conversations, and I think the key point was to really sort of to allow the educators to actually decide like what do they need, sharing and enabling sort of people to really voice what is the support, where do they see their starting point, and to not just put learning in place just for the sake of it, but to really sort of, you know, allow people to make their voice heard and really take that time to reflect. Really, the most important priorities I think that were mentioned were obviously around well-being and of course the new curriculum, but also that of course the huge process that has been made over the last year, that is not being lost, and to allocate time and space for people to sort of to really sit down to refine what they've learned, to really reflect and think about it. And I think one really interesting analogy that was brought up in the group, sort of, you know, the one train is coming into the station as the other one is about to go out. Of course, we have hopefully the COVID train coming into the station, and then we have to shift all the learning onto the new train that's literally about to depart. So to sort of to cope with that, but equally also, you know, dealing with the situation now, but thinking about the future. So it's sort of this ambivalence ultimately that is happening, but to really, give educators the space to say what they need and like what are their priorities for themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's certainly part of what, you know, my message was. I mean, there are system priorities, and I'm seeing in the chat box people listing all of those, and those are really important. There also needs to be a recognition of individual and professional needs. Does another group want to provide any feedback?
I think from my school's point of view, we're just focusing very heavily on curriculum for Wales. And that seems to have actually reinvigorated staff, because although you can get bogged down with the stress and the pressure and the worry of the last 12, 13 months, but our job still remains that we're educators, and that's what we're focusing on alongside, you know, obviously the well-being of everybody, really. So that's our goals for this coming year.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Teaching and learning remains central. Curriculum, teaching, assessment in its various forms. So thank you for bringing us back to that, Sophie. So I want to sort of wrap up by saying thank you to all of you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing the positives, but also for sharing there are undoubtedly negatives and concerns and challenges. So I think it's best that we're honest about that and think how we work our way through. So my final, you'll guess by now, I like Charlie Maxey. My final image and words from him are, "What's the best thing you've learned about storms?" "At the end," said the horse. And we will all get through this. I really appreciate what you're doing in Wales, and at the moment you are doing better than we are in Ontario, but I won't take all of your time with where our challenges are at the moment. I'm going to pause there because I did say I would allow time for some questions before we finish. So I see there are some in the chat box, and Angela, do you want to come in and we can do a sort of final few words and wrap up? And so thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thanks ever so much, Carol. Fascinating as always to listen to and learn from you. I've got 3 questions here that have just been selected randomly out of many that we've had, and hopefully we can follow up with further ones by passing them on to you post the event, I think. So the first one, how can we enhance professional autonomy during a time of large-scale system change, which often feels top-down? Do you want to take them one at a time, or shall I bundle the 3 together?
Give me all 3. I might need a reminder, but we'll see. Thank you.
And then the second one is, do you have any suggestions of how educators can best meet challenges when pupils transition, for example, from primary to secondary to post-16, when they've missed so much normal school time? And then finally, we're going to have a new Minister for Education in Wales following the elections next week. What, from the point of view of the workforce wellbeing and development, would be your advice for that new minister? Easy one.
Yeah, these are, each one is a huge question, but thank you for those questions. I'll try my best.
Thanks.
So the first question about professional autonomy and system change. So system change is inevitable. I've worked on large scale system change, and I've worked in and with several governments. So obviously in Wales, you've referenced the curriculum for Wales several times, as well as ALN and other major initiatives that you're being asked to manage. So system change isn't going to go away, but what needs to be thought about is what's the appropriate roles and responsibilities. So system change should really be at the high level of the governance and the overall direction of the education system, hopefully developed in partnership with the professionals and other key stakeholders. But the day-to-day details should be where there's some professional autonomy. Now, I don't mean complete autonomy. I don't think that's realistic or possible when we work in an education system that is directed and funded, you know, by government and by taxpayers and all of these things. But what you really don't want is micromanagement of your day-to-day lives. You know best, your students or your schools or your colleges or your workplace, and thinking about how you take some of the bigger ideas, whether it's around curriculum or assessment or student well-being. But that's the piece where it's really important that the profession have the opportunity to, as I imagine you've had to do over the past 12 months, to take leadership, to take ownership, to co-develop, to share, and to see that as valuable and valued. So obviously, without knowing all the details of your system change, I know there are a lot of changes at the moment. I would say look for where the spaces are for your professional discretion, your professional judgment, and use those spaces. Try not to be micromanaged or overly directed. You have to meet the system requirements, but think about how you use your professionalism in that context. And that's valued, and that you can talk about what's happened over the past year where the profession have had to lead the day-to-day details of the work. The piece around question 2 around transitions, yeah, that's difficult. And I mean, obviously, again, and I don't know the details of your context as well as you do, but when we look at education systems, most students have had their learning disrupted this year, even though everybody's doing their absolute best efforts. Here in Ontario, our students have been out of in-person schooling more than they've been in in-person schooling. So it's not realistic to expect that learning will have progressed in the same ways. Now, I mentioned that in some areas, you know, like independence or self-regulation or awareness of yourself in your global context has actually increased. So we need to recognize that our students have learned new things and different things. And remember the slide where students themselves are saying they want to be heard more, to have their voices taken seriously. At the same time, we know that there may well be an impact, particularly for younger learners, in terms of reading and writing and mathematics, and how we make sure that students are fully supported. So, you know, I do think in some countries last September, depending on when their school year started, they really used that first week back, and in some cases it extended beyond the first week, to really focus on where was students learning, where was their progress, and where were their needs. So I know that might not be entirely realistic to spend an entire week or more, but the conversations about where students are at really matters. You may, of course, have forms of ways of using student work, student learning to gauge where their learning's at, but also that conversation about where they're at. So I do think we need to recognise that students' learning may look different in September, and we need to make sure that they've progressed. And even beyond their learning, you've all mentioned health and well-being. We know here in Ontario that students' mental health has been affected. If we're living through a pandemic, it's a very strange time. So I just think we have to be honest and respectful that all of us have gone through this, and that will impact us. So I don't think we can expect to start back to normal, because it's not going to be back to normal. It's going to be different, and we have to value the gains, but also recognize that some of our students are really struggling at the moment. I see that. I work at university. I see that at university, my students who are adults, who are professionals, I work in educational leadership, many are struggling at the current time. A new minister, oh my. You know, the first thing I would say is to a new minister, or to any minister actually, is really take the time to build authentic, respectful partnerships with the education system. And I say that broadly because I know that there are many partners listening today. It's really, so, you know, like question one, I don't know who your new minister will be, but the majority of politicians are not from an education background. Ministers of education are more likely not to be from an education background, although they may be a parent. But really listen, build partnerships with all of your key professional associations, your stakeholder organizations. Listen, resist the urge to make sudden decisions. It's really important to listen. When I first started in Ontario back in 2005, we were at the start of a new government, and we literally spent the first few weeks at that time, when you could have these big events, you know, meeting with lots and lots and lots of people and listening and listening and listening. So I'd say to the minister, listen, get out of your government buildings and listen to the sector. They know the way forward and they know the best advice. So that would be my best advice to a new minister. It would be to take the time to listen, to build relationships, and that will go much further than running into decisive action.
Thank you so much, Carol. I'm very aware of time. I'm sure we could go on for at least another hour just having these interactions with you, because they're so valuable. You'll see from the chat that everybody is thanking you for your contribution and saying how useful it's been and how sort of grounded your approach has been. We appreciate all of the key provocations that you've given us for consideration today. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to the session, whether that's in the breakout or through the chat. You'll know as well as I do that the questions that Carol's posed for us to consider could understandably have led to the desire in those groups to explore the key issues for longer through discussion. And it's always a difficult balancing act when planning sessions like this. But I think we've had the best of both worlds today and certainly been left with a whetted appetite for more. So we will reflect on this as we look to putting on similar events in the future. I hope that you'll agree that today's session has piqued our interest, and as part of being able to help you and support you in reflecting on what's come out of today for you as an individual, we'll be providing a template for your reflection for use in your professional learning passport, and that will be available online through our website. Thank you to the School of Education at Swansea University, as always. Great partnership with you there. Very grateful to you. And a particular thanks to Beth and Stacey and her team here at the EWC who've enabled this event today. Greatly appreciated.